What went right this year and what went wrong this year with weed control? We want to talk about that today.
Well, you know, we had an extreme year for weather, no matter where you're at in the country. In the northern U.S., we had excess moisture, just inch after inch of rain kept coming. In the south, we had no moisture. So we had this year of complete extremes. Now in the north, if guys didn't put on a pre, it was a total disaster because we just couldn't get back out there timely. The weeds went wild with all the rain. It was a big problem. So that's really where I want to start.
Well, the other thing though is we have little skips in fields or little areas where the seed just didn't come up well. The plants are short. A lot of that had to do with crop just got mudded in too much this year in the northern part of the country. And I understand why. We did a little bit of it on our own farm too. We can't plant in ideal conditions all the time, but you have to understand the risk. When you do that and you're not planting in ideal conditions, you're not going to have the right plant growing, or maybe you'll have a skip or something like that. And when you don't have crop canopy, always remember that crop canopy is the very best weed killer that there is. It's so hugely important. You've got to have a good crop growing.
And I think part of that is using that pre-emerge herbicide. Now let's talk about just getting that crop up. When it has lots of competition out there, it's tougher for that crop to get up. If you can keep that field weed free, that means you're going to get the canopy that much quicker. It also means that you've taken out maybe 50%, maybe 90%. You know, it just depends on what pre you're using, of the weeds that you've got in the field. You take out half of them or most of them. Now, whatever you're coming back with post-emerge, there aren't so many weeds out there, and it's a little easier to get good coverage on those weeds, and it's also just easier to take them out.
So if you let weeds come up, don't listen to these people that tell you, oh, you can let your weeds get 4 to 6 inches tall and you haven't lost much yield. Come on. There's no way you're raising 300-400 bushel corn if you've got any weeds out in that field. You've got to have good weed control, and it's got to start with a pre-emerge herbicide.
Well, here's the problem, Brian. A lot of guys couldn't get out there when that corn was 4 to 6 inches tall because it was too wet and it just kept raining, and now all of a sudden the weeds got a little bigger. And here's where I saw a lot of problems this year. We had weeds, especially the broadleaves, that were just a little bit bigger than we would like. And many guys just went out with the same rate of herbicide they went out with before. They went out with 22 ounces of Power Max, kind of your quart equivalent rate. And they said, oh, you know, that'll probably still get it because I've been overdoing it for years. And, you know, those weeds, I've been killing them really well with that rate. So I'm sure it's enough even for some of those bigger weeds. Well, guess what? Not only are there a few weeds that are becoming tolerant to Roundup or even some resistant weeds, it just isn't enough rate. It's not going to get to every growing point. And what we saw was some of those weeds died from the top down. You know, the newest growing points are the ones that the Roundup's going to go to first. And then all of a sudden, you know, there's a few inches of growth at the bottom that just never died, and then it re-sprouted. The other thing that we saw is guys throwing in take mix partners. 2.5 ounces of status. We've been pounded with that rate at 2.5, 2.5, 2.5. Well, 2.5 is just a little helper rate. You need to go to at least 5 ounces if you have some bigger weeds, especially if Roundup isn't going to do anything for you. Because if you've got a weed that's becoming Roundup resistant, now you aren't going to put a half rate or a third rate out there of a broadleaf herbicide. You have to put a full rate out there if you want to do a good job.
Yeah, and there were farmers all over the country, and we did it ourselves on our own farm. We went out with 1 ounce of Callisto on some stuff. So, hey, why spend $12, Darren, when I can spend $4? But seriously, I mean, we can get by with it up to a point. And when you start having Roundup resistant weeds, well, that's the point where you have to say, you know, I can't get by with that 1/3 or 1/2 rate anymore of the broadleaf product, the Callisto, Loudus, Impact, Status, any of those things. You've got to bump her up to the full rate to actually kill those weeds.
And really, those low rates aren't working because if you have a Roundup resistant weed, putting Roundup in the spray tank is just like putting more water in there. It's not doing anything for you at all other than there's a tiny little bit of surfactant in there. And speaking of surfactant, here's where I see a lot of guys making a mistake too. Picking the right adjuvant package is so critical. Now you say, wait a minute, what are you talking about? I'm using a fully loaded Roundup and I'm mixing things with that. Come on, guys, that Roundup has some surfactant to make Roundup work. It doesn't have the right surfactant to make every other herbicide in the market work.
What kind of surfactant is it?
Well, it's a cationic surfactant.
Right, and what kind do you need for Status or Select Max or any of those other products?
Well, typically we're using a non-ionic surfactant, and even with some of these products, we like to see some oil in the tank. It's going to be more effective. It's going to do a better job on the weeds. But of course, Roundup says, well, you know, we don't know if we want that oil in there. Maybe you can use a non-ionic surfactant. So there are a lot of guys trying to get by with some surfactant in there that maybe isn't the right one.
The other thing that we did this year on our farm for the first time ever is we used a pre-emerge herbicide by plane. We had 55 acres that was so ridiculously wet, and we lucked out that we had about a 4-hour window to plant this thing, and we got it planted. Then it started raining, and it was wet for the next month. And I told our guys, you know, we have no hope of getting this sprayed with the ground rig, so we called the plane in. And it happens about once every 3 or 4 years. We have to call a plane in to do some job that we just can't get done with a ground rig. If you need to do it, you pull the trigger. So that's what we did. I hate to spend the money too when we got the sprayer sitting right there in the shed, but when you just can't get to it, you can't get to it. You gotta call a spade and get out and get it done. Because if you don't get that pre down, then you have weed control problems for the rest of the year.
Well, that's right. And you know, sometimes there are some tough decisions. Every year the weather's a little bit different. I mean, all the conditions are different. There's no 2 years exactly the same. You just have to say, you know what, at this point, I have to do something. I can't wait thinking, you know, in a few days it'll be better. In a few days it'll be better. There has to be a point where you say, I've got to make that tough decision. I just have to get things done because I can't give up yield.
And maybe that point is when you get our Weed of the Week. We'll tell you how to stop it on your farm coming up later in the show.